You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
Heavy sigh.
Heavy sigh.
Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan. I'm here with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great.
So the heavy sigh, was that associated with the program, or was that a personal thing? Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, Mike.
Exactly. It was a respiratory enhancer.
Yeah. How are you today?
I'm good.
So anything, you know what? I just made a bunch of doodle marks on my paper, and the ink was wet, and now I've gotten it all over my hands.
Okay.
Anything exciting going on in your life?
Not a thing.
Yeah.
I live a very calm existence in my retirement.
Yeah. I'm getting very, very close to my daughter's graduation from medical school, and man,
it's exciting.
It is exciting,
And for her, yeah.
You know, and I am so not a fan of parents living their lives vicariously through their children.
Well, that's interesting that you would say that.
Because I do it so much. And yet I can't help but exude pride for this. I mean, I'm just so proud of her, because you know that Jen has always been a very high achieving student. She was a very high achieving student even in her medical program, and she is just so humble and so, in some ways, self-deprecating. And I just want to shake her sometimes and say, don't you see how great you are?
Didn't I raise you right? Be more like me.
But no, it's fantastic that she is that way. But I'm just so proud of her, so happy. And I'm really, really proud and envious of the relationship she has with her husband and how great that they appear to be doing together. I'm just, man, it just seems like it's all coming up sevens for them, and I'm just so happy.
It's what you would wish for.
Yep. And, you know, the truth is, your youngest child, you feel the same way about.
Yeah?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not like I'm in isolation saying these positive things.
So, clinically,
Yeah.
what are we going to talk about?
So I have realized, looking at the catalog of Psych with Mikes, that we have never spoken directly on the subject of adoption.
Huh. I don't know that I had realized that.
And I don't think that either one of us ignored the issue, but it's just never been something that we've talked about. But it is obviously a pretty significant issue in society and a pretty significant issue in therapy. I don't know about you, but I know that I had dozens of clients who came in either acknowledging initially that this was the primary therapeutic issue, or it came up through the course of therapy.
Well, that's most often the case.
Yeah.
As you know, learning in school and in experience, the presenting problem is almost never the problem that really drives them into therapy. But I think part of the reason that we've never talked about it is both of us have life experiences around the topic of adoption. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is to have a conversation that's clinical and professional, and not personal. Right.
So, in full disclosure, I brought this up to you before, and we did a show. And one of the things that happened was that I was way too close to it because of some of the things that had happened in my life personally. And while the show was probably pretty good, I mean, clinically there was some value there.
In the last half, or two-thirds.
But there was part of it, that I was, and when I listened to it, I agreed 100%. It was just way, way, way too personalized for me.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think that's why we've probably shied away from it. And yet it is a really, really significant issue, and it is one that deserves a conversation. And so we decided to revisit it and try and revisit the topic in a way that was just much more clinical and not as personalized.
Yeah. I also think, since we attempted the first dry run, on reflection, I think that our culture has evolved over the last 30 years pretty significantly around the topic of adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when they first became an organization and started advocating for changes in the advertising media and the laws and the way people laughed off about, oh, I was drunk and I was driving and, you know, what can you expect? Now it's really become acknowledged pretty universally it's a stupid and bad thing to be a drunk driver.
Well, yeah.
And for many of the years of my life, both personally and as a clinician, the cultural imagery around adoption was much more negative. The implication that there was something secretive about it that needed to be kept secret for whatever reasons. And I'm careful not to say ashamed because I don't think that was the driving factor.
Okay, so do you think that, I think that at least a part of that was that adoptive parents oftentimes didn't know how to bring the subject up with their children for fear that the child would want to rush out and find the biological parents.
Or for fear that the child would feel less than and damaged and unwanted in some way.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that
choice,
that was bad, that the parents were bad for that, but I think it is a really hard thing as an adoptive parent.
But there is more literature and research, there are more support groups, there's more cultural openness now to the consideration that it's just another style of family and that there's not any inherent failing on anybody's part. The parent that put the child up for the adoption, the child that was adopted, the parents that did the adoption. Then there's a sidebar of that to considering the societal responses to foster care and what do we do with children that are taken from their biological parents because of criminality or inadequacy in some level, and societally, what do we do about those kids? So the topic is a very pregnant topic, a lot of pain for all the players. And as a clinician, how do you approach having conversations with people on the topic of adoption? And do they bring it up? Do you wait for them to bring it up? If you have information that makes you think, well, you know, can we talk about this? Is that a concern for you? They will often say, oh, no, it's fine. So you almost have to say, well, which market am I going to here? Am I talking about, as parents of an adopted child, how do I teach that child, speak to that child, normalize with that child the whole reality that he's adopted, or I just keep it secret from him? And if I have an adopted child, and my adopted child has issues, emotional distress reactions, how do I have conversations with them, or how do I get them the support that they need to address it?
And I think that this is an issue. We recently did a show on disabilities, and I don't know if it'll come out before this one or not, but
well, you have to ask our producer.
Yeah, good luck. And when we were talking about that, one of the things that we really identified was there's not a lot of education in this area. I think adoption is another thing in mental health that we don't do much education about. And so we don't have a backlog of literature that says this is the best way to approach it, whether you should be open with your children, whether you should be more secretive, let them come to you. I mean, all of these things I think are in flux. And again, just like with the disabilities question, it all comes down to a very individual kind of predilection for that person. And so I think that it is difficult to know what are the best practices. I certainly can understand how, as an adopted parent, it would be difficult to bring that up to your child. But I also understand from the child's perspective why they would want to know.
I don't agree with you that it's difficult to bring it up to the child. Reality is, as a matter of fact, reality is you're adopted. So you start telling the child from day one.
How many
you start having
reality
conversations within the hearing of the child
are difficult for people to grasp in therapy?
So, which brings me to the point that I want to make. As a clinician, as a therapist, you have to be careful not to be agenda driven. Your agenda for how you see adoption and how you want them to see adoption. I think you always have to deal with what's in front of you, what they bring to the table. Who are they? Which one of the players in this team are they? And how are they experiencing their concern about adoption?
Because the experience that the adopted parent has is different than the experience of the biological parent that is different than the child. Every single person in this equation has a different experience, and so we need to approach that from their perspective.
But part of the cultural changes that have happened in the last 30 years, now most states allow for what they call open adoption, which means that the records are open. When I was a young child, my mother had a child that she put up for adoption. At that point, that was a shame-based thing, and the records were closed. And the child couldn't come back and find my mother or the biological father of that child. Now, most states allow that option. So if you are the biological parent who's putting a child up for adoption, you can sign to say, yeah, they have permission to come back and see this data and get this information. And in some states, it doesn't matter whether you sign permission. They have the right to get it. There are also...
usually it has to do with some age when they say your age of responsibility, whether that's 18 or 21.
But they can show up on your doorstep someday. Which is what eventually happened to my mother, which was kind of a miracle because the laws hadn't changed. But the boy that she had found her when he was an adult, for which she was very grateful. But the support messaging in the culture has changed. And the messaging now is much less shame-based, negative, punitive, controlling from the nanny state or the daddy state, and more open to saying, hey, if you're one of these people, you have a right to have access to this information. Now, what do you do with it? And so clinically, the question for me is, well, okay, if we get this information, what's your question? What do you do with it? It's like the joke that people tell about teaching their children about sex. Mommy, Daddy, where did I come from? And you tell them the whole birds and bees thing, and they're sitting there agitated on the chair, and at the end they say, yeah, but Joey next door comes from Oklahoma. So one of the things that you want to learn as a therapist is to ask, what is your question?
Make sure you know what the information that person wants is. You don't go off
on your own agenda and start delivering information and messaging.
So from my perspective, clinically, I see the most important issue from the child's perspective being one of identity. Do you agree with that?
I don't know what you mean by that. My experience with that has been the fundamental question was, why didn't they want me? Why was I not kept? Why was I put out?
So that
may be what you mean by identity. Say more. When you say that, what does it mean?
By identity, what I mean is that for us, we are psychodynamic in the way that we see psychology. And so specifically, we believe that we all have an id, an ego, a superego. We don't have to go into all of but within the ego, which is the reality testing function of the psyche, and within that lives our identity. So our definition of self and our perception of who we are and what makes us operate, what makes us tick. And in my experience, mostly what these individuals are looking for is an answer to an unchecked box. I don't understand where I came from. And a part of that may be, why didn't they want me? But also a part of that is, I want to just have some perception. I may not even want to know those people, but I just would like to have some perception of who those people were, because I feel like I have an incomplete perception of who I am.
Sometimes there's some real curiosity around health-related concerns or issues. Am I biologically susceptible to certain diseases? Am I more likely to be infected by certain illnesses? Should I have children of my own because of genetics? So there's some real question about just medical things. But yeah, there are questions about, my wife and I watched some movie on TV last night, and the main character thought she was adopted, although her parents swore she wasn't. But she thought she was because she wasn't like anybody else in the family.
Yeah.
She wasn't interested in any things they were interested in. She didn't like the things they liked. She didn't do the things they did. And she's like, I don't belong to this family. I'm an alien baby. I'm a pod baby. And so I've had those conversations with adopted kids who say, I'm not like these people. So what am I like, or who am I like? And then sometimes that's foundational is a counseling question. Say more about how it is that you're not like them. What is it that's causing you distress? Are you angry? Are you sad? Are you confused? Are you perplexed? And what behaviors are involved? Maybe this is just, right now, developmentally, adolescent, you're angry because they're trying to establish parental controls and you don't want to do what they're asking you to do. So the easiest answer for you is to say, well, I'm adopted.
Right.
You know what? Screw you. Because you don't really care about me, and I don't have to listen to you. You're not my real mother. You do that stuff, and to me, that conversation isn't any different than having a second wife or second husband in the mix. You're my adopted parent. You're not my real parent. So I don't have to listen to you. I don't want to listen to you. So clinically, what you have to do then, again, is say, what do you want to know about where do you come from? What's driving the question? What do you need for an answer?
Right. And a lot of times, I think that individual may have some difficulty articulating that. They may not know. They may feel like they want to know something, but they may not know what it is that they want to know. And so then you have to sit with them and walk through the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you experience it?
Because it's a process.
Yeah.
And so if you get them to talk more about what that means to them, eventually you're probably going to identify what it is that they want to know.
Well, so this is a broad spectrum topic. Acknowledging the cultural changes of the last 30 years. About 30 years ago in Chicago, there was an adoption case that made national headlines and led to changes in laws in a lot of states.
So can we take our break, and when we come back, you can tell us that story?
Yeah.
If you've gotten this far into the show, then obviously you find the show to be worthwhile, beneficial, maybe even helpful. And so I just wanted to say, if you've gotten this far into the show and you want to help us out, even if you don't want to help us out, just do it anyway. Go to Apple Podcasts and rate us and leave a review. That is super helpful. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and hit the bell icon so that you get notifications when new shows drop. That stuff is really, really helpful for us. And I know that Mr. Brett agrees.
Absolutely. Reviews are positive. Positive reviews are more positive, but negative ones are as well, because it helps you decide how to focus and how whatever you're intending to say is being heard.
And the secret is the algorithm doesn't care whether the review's positive or negative.
As our friend Mike Norton says regularly, feedback is a gift.
If it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike. Okay, we're back, and you were going to tell us a story about laws that changed in Chicago.
It was called the Baby Richard case. And this woman got pregnant and put the child up for adoption. She couldn't be responsible for him. She was a very young girl, didn't have any resources. So she put the child up for adoption. Family adopted the child, had the child for 3 years. The biological father of the child shows up and says, hey, I want this child. I want to be involved in his life. Little boy, Baby Richard. And it went through the courts. There was national notoriety, a lot of distress on all sides. Everybody had an answer. Everybody knew the right answer. But the courts ultimately decided, you know what? This family that has adopted and had this child since day one from the hospital for 3 years has to give him back.
Oh, give him back
and
to the
dad.
dad?
The biological father can have him. Because his rights, the biological father's rights, were ignored and denied. So that led to upheaval in laws all over the country about requiring that the biological father be informed of a pregnancy and sign off on an adoption. So,
regardless of the relationship with the biological mother, so it could be a one-night stand.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if I agree with that, but okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying that.
I hear you.
Cultural echoes were horrendous, and adoption agencies around the country were terrified because people were reluctant to follow through on adoptions.
Sure.
And haven't asked themselves the question. So I had this child for 3 years, 5 years. I've nurtured him. I've raised him. He's my child. And now some bozo from Timbuktu comes along and says, "Well, he's mine. I want him back." Am I going to leave the country? Am I going to move to Canada so that they can't get him? Am I going to allow that and say, "Well, okay, now you take him"? What am I going to do? Am I going to end up in prison? Am I going to kill somebody? So there's a lot of garbage going on there. So the system had to shake itself out and find better answers for those procedures. And for a while, families that were looking into adoptions had to be very careful and make sure they had lawyers that could dot all the I's and cross all the T's, make sure that all the players were on board and signed off legally. Then you get, your adoption could go through.
Right.
Subsequently, though, again, the laws in the different states have changed. But the reason I raised the question, the issue of the rights, so the question of parental ownership. Do I own my child? I have rights as a parent that the state can take away from me, but they have to jump through all these hoops to deny me access to my child. And say, well, you can't have information about the child's schooling. You can't have information about his health. You can't have information about his placement or his survival because you're unworthy. So the state can do that. So societally, how do we address the question of parental ownership? Do I own my child? Or is my child an independent entity that I have a responsibility for and an obligation to nurture, support, fund?
I think that the two of us would probably come down on the side of you don't own your child.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But a lot of people think that you do.
No, I know.
And the fundamentalist Christian thing, the spare the rod, spoil the child.
Right.
And I mean, I'm all over the place today. There's a conversation that comes up about homeschooling. When teachers are trained and as mandated reporters must respond if they think a child is being abused. If they observe something that says, "Oh, this kid's being abused," then the teacher has to go to the school principal and say, "Hey, I have this information." The principal says, depending on the school district, the principal may say, "Okay, I got it now. You're off the table. I'll deal with it." So then the principal has to deal with it. Do they call the state and make a report? Does the state come out and investigate? Or do they just say, "Well, we know this family and it's not what the teacher thought it was." All these games get played. But very regularly, especially in rural communities in America, when those things come to someone in authority's attention, the family decides to pull that kid out of school and homeschool.
Yeah, sure.
So
solves the problem.
It solves the problem of being visible under questioning for child abuse.
Being facetious.
Yeah.
So the one thing that I think is a constant in all of the information that I found on this subject and that I've ever seen is that the greatest positive that comes out of an adoptive situation is a more stable home environment. Anytime that you can provide, and there's lots of things that people talk about as being positives for adoption,
well, that's the
but
literature.
They all follow directly from a stable home environment.
And that's one of the points that gets made in the comparative literature between adoption, foster home placement. Because a lot of times your kids are taken by the state for a period of time. Your mother's in jail. When she gets out of jail, she can have you back. But we need a place to park you where we think you're reasonably safe. So they put them in foster care. The horror stories that you hear about foster care are truly unendurable. And yet, there are some beautiful stories of good, caring people who are salvation points for the survival and development of these children.
Right.
So some foster home placements are ideal. But the literature is saying an adoption in a traditional family or non-traditional family, same gender parents, whatever, is better for the child to live in a stable home environment over time.
And that doesn't mean that those parents are perfect. You don't have to be a perfect parent to be a great adoptive parent. You just have to be able to provide.
I know are my wife and I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're the only ones that I know.
Exactly.
So for anybody who thinks that is a panacea, it is not. It's just the more stable the environment, the better that anybody is going to be as a person. And one of the things that I think is so important for us to remember is the reason we have a foster care system in the United States is because after World War II, we said that orphanages were not good.
Yeah.
And so we got rid of orphanages, and that's when the foster care system was established. We haven't always had a foster care system in the United States.
Right.
And so the truth is there is no perfect system.
Right.
There were some things that were positive about orphanages and some things that were negative. There are some things that are positive about the foster care system and some things that are negative. But the bottom line is the more stable the environment is for the individual, the better that it's going to be for them.
Yeah. Well, segue, but it's on that thought line. The research literature shows that if you have two parents that are working and they have to put their child in daycare, whether it's an adopted child or whether it's a biological child, that if they can find a daycare center when they're looking that has stable, consistent caregivers. So if you got a high turnover of caregivers at the daycare center, it's less likely to be the environment that you want.
I mean, that just makes sense.
But if you go and you interview and you look around, they say all our staff's been here 5-10 years. It's much more likely to be the place you want.
Which is a huge concern post-pandemic because we know that is the number one thing that child care organizations are talking about is it's so hard to keep good staff.
Yeah.
And it's something that if we don't address, I just don't understand why we can't, as a society, find a way to fund healthcare, even if it's universal child care. I keep saying healthcare. Child care.
Healthcare.
There's nothing more important than that. Why can't we figure out in the most affluential country in the world a way?
Obstinate obstructionism.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that just really makes me hot under the collar.
Yeah.
But so we agree that stable environment, that's the single most important thing to provide for these individuals. And then when they come to therapy, I characterize that as identity. Whatever the questions are, how do you approach that with somebody who comes and says, I have some questions about being adopted and I want to try and explore that?
I say, what are your questions? And what do you need in the way of answers?
So what do you find to be the most common question? Have you found a common question?
I think with the experience that I had, the most common question was, why didn't they want me?
Why didn't they want me?
So then you have to try to explore that. What do we know? What information do we have? What were the circumstances?
Right.
And that information may not be available.
Right, exactly.
So, and then sometimes you get into a situation where it becomes available, or especially now with the law changes, and they can find biological parents. The question then becomes, okay, it's clinically just like I want to confront my abuser. Well, what happens if the abuser looks at you and says, you're lying, it didn't happen?
Right.
How's it going to impact you?
Or you wanted it.
Yeah. So the same thing happens in this dialogue. You have to say, let's think about it. Let's just don't jump on the bus and drive over to somebody's house and knock on the door and say, hey, Daddy, let's think about it. What do you need? What are you looking for? How will you know if you've gotten it? What happens to you if they're not receptive in the way that you hope they would be?
And I think
so those are all grist for the mill of therapy.
That clinically, I've always known intuitively that the stable environment was the most important thing. Because when somebody says that to me, says, oh, why didn't they want me? And especially if I can't answer that question, what I say is, well, let's reframe the question. And if I could tell you that your biological parents believed, whether it was true or not, that they weren't able to give you a stable home environment, and they wanted you to have that, would that be an answer for you?
Right.
And I think that people really, when you
did they make an appropriate parental sacrifice?
Yes. It isn't that they didn't want you, it's that they were so in love with you that they wanted you to have a better life than they could provide.
They were so aware of their own limitations. restrictions, whatever those might be. And they were willing to say, it's better for this child to live in a different environment than it is to live in an environment with me if I don't have the capacity or the resources to take care of them.
I've always found people to be comforted by that.
Yeah.
And
if you can get them there.
Yeah.
But first you got to listen to them. You got to squeeze out the sponge. Whatever and especially if in the adopted home, those were not discussions that were available. Those were not curiosities that were respected. And again, the literature pretty strongly says, start normalizing this reality from day one. And don't hide it or be ashamed of it. Answer their questions. Find out what they're asking, but answer their questions.
I had a client one time, and the mom came in first and said, this child is adopted, the child knows it, and I never want you to speak of it.
Yeah.
And I said,
not going to happen.
I don't think
find another therapist.
That I can make that promise to you. If you want me to work with the child, then I mean, I'm not going to make that promise to you. I'm not going to hold myself to that, but I certainly will explore what it is about that, you know, why do we need to have that rule? And the truth is that's all the kid wanted to talk about.
Yeah. Well, of course. It was the last thing that the mom wanted to talk about. The question is why?
Right.
What's your payoff for this? What are you getting out of this?
And so that's another thing though that you might get in therapy.
Yeah.
And so because we started off with, do you own the child? And if a parent comes to you who's paying the bills and has legal custody of that child and says you can only provide therapy within this context, if you agree to that, then you better stick to that, or else you could be in violation of some trust with the parent. But
you could also be in violation of laws in some states.
And so I would encourage therapists to not ever make that. You may think that that's a good idea at the time. Well, I'll make this concession to the parent, but then we'll do our own thing and don't do that.
You get invested in keeping access to the child or to the client, whoever the client is. But to me, that's just a huge red flag that says, let's talk to you, Mom, about why you would say that.
Right.
Help me understand why this is coming out of your mouth this way.
And so I would want to explore that with the mom.
Oh, yeah.
But I would tell any therapist who's in that situation, do not make that promise.
Well, yeah.
Even if it means that they say, okay, well, we're going to go see somebody else.
I had the same thing happen with it. I had a client that was referred to me that had a history of molesting children sexually. And I was reluctant to work with him, but I eventually agreed that I would. There were some additional ingredients. But I said to him, you have to understand, if I'm going to work with you, I will endeavor to listen to you and hear what it is you have to say in a clinically appropriate way. But if you cause me to become aware that a child, an individual specific child that I know of, is at risk, then I'm going to report to the authorities. I can't work with you any other way. And the gentleman looked at me and said, I don't think I like that. I said, I don't think I care. And he said, well, I worked with this person and that person, and they agreed to do it the way I wanted. And I said, then legally they're in jeopardy. They shouldn't have done it. But I'm not going to do it. So if you cause me to know this, understand that I'm going to report it. And then we can have conversations about whatever. And he tested it.
I was just going to say, and he inevitably tested it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he set that up. And I reported it. And he called me a hateful name. And I said, you knew. I told you. We're grown-ups.
But he didn't stop therapy.
No. Well, he couldn't. He was court ordered.
But he didn't have to do it with you.
Right.
So hopefully that was beneficial for people, and obviously this is a huge subject and we may have to revisit it, but I liked where this went. I felt good about it. So the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. We would love it if you would find us on the internets, on YouTube. You can find us at Psych with Mike, and please subscribe to the show there. You can find us on iTunes, Psych with Mike, and you can leave us a comment and give us a rating. That would be super beneficial. As always, the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.